child's cough started 3 days ago. Now she's drowning in air that's turned to poison. Her mother holds her close, both their faces covered in ash-soaked rags, but it's not enough. Nothing is enough anymore. Outside their cave, the world has gone dark at noon. Not from clouds, but from the mountain that exploded 2,000 miles away and murdered the sun. 74,000 years ago, while you're watching this video in your warm home with your next meal guaranteed, your ancestors were dying. Not some of them, 90% of them. In the next 72 hours, this little girl will either become one of the fewer than 10,000 humans left alive on planet Earth, or she'll join the mountains of corpses already frozen in the endless volcanic winter. But here's what should terrify you. She's your great-great-grandmother, multiplied by 3,000 generations. If she dies, you're never born. None of us are. The entire human race, 8 billion people today, hangs by a thread so thin that a single child's next breath could snap it. This is the story of how a supervolcano turned Earth into an alien planet, how the sky bled ash for years, how plants died, animals vanished, and humans were hunted by their own starvation. This is the story of the Toba Winter, when our entire species came within a handful of heartbeats of total extinction. And the only reason you exist to watch this, because that dying child and her mother were about to discover something in the next desperate hours that would change everything. Something so simple, yet so revolutionary, that it would save not just their lives, but yours too. The mountain had 74,000 years to kill us. It almost succeeded. Almost. The antelope was perfectly positioned. After 3 days of tracking, Kuda's band had finally cornered the herd against the cliff face. His daughter, barely 13 summers old, gripped her first real spear. Today, she would become a hunter. Today, she would feed her people. Then the ground screamed. Not a rumble, not a shake. A scream that came from the center of the earth itself. So deep, it bypassed the ears and went straight to the bones. Birds exploded from trees in clouds so thick they darkened the morning sun. The antelope forgot their terror of humans and bolted past the hunters close enough to touch, their eyes white with a fear that transcended species. Kuda's daughter dropped her spear. "Father, what?" The mountain exploded. 2,000 miles away, in what would one day be called Sumatra, Toba had awakened. But Kuda didn't know about Toba, didn't know about supervolcanoes or pyroclastic flows or volcanic winters. All he knew was that the northern horizon had transformed into a pillar of fire that connected earth to sky, and the world his grandfather's grandfather had known was ending. The sound arrived 40 minutes later. When modern Americans think of loud, they think of rock concerts at 115 decibels, maybe a gunshot at 1400. The Toba eruption hit 310 decibels at source, loud enough to rupture organs, to turn sound itself into a weapon. By the time it reached Kuda's band in East Africa, it had weakened to merely deafening. Children screamed, adults clutched their heads, blood trickled from ears. But the sound was just the herald, the real killer was coming. Within hours, the sky began to darken. Not clouds, this was different. This was the sun itself being eaten, bite by something hungry and grey. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, then 20. Ash began to fall like snow that burned the tongue and clogged the throat. Kuda had lived through droughts, through floods, through lions and diseases that killed half the children before they could walk. But this was the mountain spirits themselves declaring war on everything that breathed. The ash fell heavier, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world painted in grey death. His band numbered 37 souls, extended family mostly, 3 nursing mothers, 8 children who couldn't yet throw a spear. 4 elders who remembered the last time the earth shook, though nothing like this. They looked to him for answers, and Kuda had none. Except one, the cave. Their winter shelter, 2 days' walk toward the coast. If they could reach it before. A child coughed, then another. The ash was finding its way into lungs, coating throats, turning breath itself into labor. Kuda's daughter tried to speak but produced only a grey-tinted wheeze. The very air had become their enemy. "Cover your faces," he commanded, tearing strips from his hide wrap. "Breathe through cloth. Stay close. We move for the cave." They'd prepared for predators, for rival bands, for hunger and thirst and the 100 other deaths that stalked their world. But how do you prepare for the sky to fall? How do you fight an enemy that comes as air itself? As they began their desperate march toward shelter, Kuda couldn't know that 90% of his species would be dead within a decade. Couldn't know that the few who survived would carry this trauma in their very DNA, a bottleneck written in genes that every human today still carries. All he knew was that the world had ended, and somehow, impossibly, they were still alive. For now, the first night was almost normal. Almost. If you ignored the taste of ash on every breath, the way the stars seemed dimmer, how the children wouldn't stop crying about the burning in their throats. Kuda's band had made good time, covering half the distance to the cave before darkness forced them to stop. "Tomorrow will be better," old Naya whispered, cradling her grandson. "The mountain will sleep again. The sun will return." She was wrong. Kuda woke to a world without dawn. Where sunrise should have painted the eastern sky, there was only a sick, grey twilight. The sun, when it finally appeared, was a pale ghost of itself, a dim orange ball you could stare at without blinking. And the ash fell heavier than yesterday. "Papa, I can't see the path," his daughter wheezed. She was right. The familiar landmarks were vanishing under a blanket of grey death. The baobab tree where they'd gathered water last season was now a skeletal shadow. The stream they'd planned to follow was a sluggish trickle of mud. And the ash kept falling. By midday, though who could tell anymore, they'd covered less than 5 miles. Half what they needed. The nursing mothers were struggling, their babies refusing milk that tasted of sulfur and smoke. The elderly moved like the walking dead, each step an agony of will. Then they found the first bodies. Another band, maybe 20 strong, scattered along what had been a game trail, dead less than a day, their faces grey masks of suffocation. Children curled against parents who could no longer protect them. Strong hunters reduced to ash-covered corpses. "Don't look," Kuda commanded. But it was too late. His people had seen their future. "We should take their water gourds," someone suggested. Practical, necessary, horrifying. They did. As they pilfered from the dead, Kuda noticed something that chilled him more than the corpses. Animal tracks, or rather the absence of them. No antelope prints, no lion spoor, no bird calls. The world wasn't just dying, it was emptying. The darkness deepened as they traveled. Not night darkness, but something altogether worse. A perpetual twilight that turned noon to dusk and dusk to blindness. The ash cloud was thickening, rising miles into the sky, spreading across the world like a cancer of shadow. "The ancestors are angry," muttered Yuki, one of the hunters. "We've offended them. This is punishment." "Then why punish the children?" Kuda snapped, immediately regretting his sharpness. Fear was making them all brittle. "Save your breath for walking." But privately, he wondered. Every culture had stories of the world's end. His grandmother had spoken of a time when the sky burned and the good people were taken to live with the spirits. Was this that time? Were they the ones left behind? By late afternoon, or what passed for it in this eternal grey, they reached the hills that marked the final approach to their cave. Hope flickered. Just 5 more miles. They could make it before true darkness fell. Then the wind changed. It came from the north, carrying with it a fresh wave of ash, so thick it was like walking through grey water. Visibility dropped to arm's length. Children disappeared in the murk, their cries muffled by the suffocating air. The band compressed, holding on to each other, a human chain fighting through apocalypse. "The cave," someone shouted. "I see the cave." They stumbled forward, hope driving exhausted legs. But as they drew closer, Kuda's heart sank. Dark shapes moved near the entrance. Others had found their shelter first, many others. 3 bands had already claimed the cave, maybe 60 people crammed into a space meant for 30. Suspicious eyes watched as Kuda's group approached. Hands moved to spears. "There's no room," the largest man stated, not a question. A fact backed by desperation. Kuda counted his people, counted theirs. Calculated odds he didn't like. His band had children, elderly, exhausted adults. The cave dwellers were mostly young adults, strong, federal, rested. "We have children," he tried. "Babies who won't survive the night outside." "So do we." No sympathy. Survival had already begun its ugly mathematics. That's when Kuda noticed the smell. Not ash. He'd grown noseblind to that. Something else. Death. Coming from inside the cave. How many had already died in there? How many more would? "Papa," his daughter tugged his arm. "Look." She pointed east, where the horizon should have been. But there was no horizon anymore. Just a wall of absolute darkness, advancing like a living thing. True night was coming, and with it, temperatures that would kill anyone caught in the open. Kuda had led his people for 15 summers, made countless life and death decisions, but never this. Fight for the cave and watch his family die in battle. Accept exile and watch them freeze in darkness. The wind howled, driving ash like frozen needles. Someone's baby wailed. He couldn't tell whose anymore. The darkness crept closer, eating the world inch by inch. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, Toba continued to vomit death into the sky, unaware and uncaring that below its ash cloud, humanity was learning the hardest lesson of all. When the world ends, it doesn't end all at once. It ends one impossible choice at a time. The mountain didn't care about species. When Toba split the earth open, it sent death equally to all humans who walked the planet. But those humans weren't all the same. 3 different kinds of human watched the sky darken that day, each bringing different tools, biological and technological, to the fight for survival. In the frozen forests of Europe, Grak of the Neanderthals felt the ground shudder. Built like a linebacker, with a barrel chest that could process thin air and muscles that made Homo sapiens look like children, he barely glanced up from butchering a reindeer. Earthquakes happened. The sky darkening. Winter came early sometimes. When you're built for ice ages, a little volcanic winter doesn't immediately register as apocalypse. His clan of 12, all family, all looking like variations of the same stocky template, had claimed this German valley for 3 generations. They knew every cave, every stream, every migration route. When ash began falling 2 days later, Grak's grandmother simply moved their activities deeper into the cave. "Strange snow," she grunted in their simple language, examining the grey flakes. "Tastes of fire." Neanderthals had survived 300,000 years of European weather that would kill a modern human in hours. Their bodies were furnaces, requiring 5,000 calories a day just to maintain baseline metabolism. When the volcanic winter dropped temperatures another 15 degrees, they simply ate more. When the reindeer grew scarce, they switched to rabbits, then birds, then things modern humans would consider inedible. "We endure," Grak told his son, teaching him to nap flint in the dimness. "Sky changes, land changes, we remain." 4,000 miles east, the Denisovans faced Toba with different gifts. Lynn, though she had no name for herself beyond the gesture that meant self, stood 7 feet tall on the Tibetan plateau. Her people were giants among humans, with lungs that could process air at altitudes that would leave others gasping. When Toba's ash began falling, they were already living in one of Earth's harshest environments. The Denisovan response was mobility. Within days of the eruption, Lynn's band had packed their few possessions and begun walking, not in panic, but with purpose. They'd survived by never staying still, by following resources across impossible landscapes. Volcanic winter was just another reason to move. The high paths remained clear, Lynn's mate observed, studying the ash patterns. Up here, winds scoured the peaks clean, even as valleys filled with grey death. "We go above the ash." Her people had another advantage, genetic diversity that would make modern humans jealous. Where Homo sapiens were already bottlenecking toward genetic uniformity, Denisovans carried adaptations for everything: altitude, cold, disease. Some could digest plants that would poison others. Some had night vision that turned darkness into mere dimness. But it was in Africa where the species facing extinction brought intangible weapons to the fight. Kuda's Homo sapiens had neither Neanderthal strength nor Denisovan endurance. Standing outside the overcrowded cave, watching darkness swallow the world, they had bodies built for running, not fighting, lungs that needed clean air, metabolisms that demanded regular feeding. But they had something else. "The river," his daughter whispered, the same one who'd almost made her first kill before the world ended. "The ash is falling, but it's not sticking to the water. If we follow the river..." "It leads to the coast," Kuda finished. His mind raced, not just following water, but following it to where rivers met ocean, where shellfish clung to rocks, where seaweed grew, where ash couldn't contaminate everything. Inside the cave, the 3 bands were already beginning to fight over space, over water, over fear. But Kuda was thinking further ahead, not just tonight, not just tomorrow, but next season, next year. "We need more than shelter," he told his band. "We need a plan." That word, plan, didn't exist in Neanderthal vocabulary. Denisovans had no concept for it. But Homo sapiens had been planning since before they were fully human, planning hunts, planning seasons, and now planning for apocalypse. While Grak's Neanderthals hunkered down to outlast the winter through sheer biological stubbornness, and Lynn's Denisovans walked their traditional paths above the ashline, Kuda's sapiens began something revolutionary. They adapted their behavior faster than their bodies could evolve. "We make masks," he decided, remembering how one mother had wrapped her baby's face. "Everyone. Now, tear cloth. Use water to dampen it. The ash can't kill what it can't reach. We travel at night when the ash settles." Another added, "Rest during the day under shelter. We send scouts ahead to find clear water. We share knowledge with other bands." That last suggestion stopped everyone cold. Share with strangers, during catastrophe, when every resource might mean life or death. "The mountain fights all humans," Kuda said slowly. "Maybe all humans must fight together." It was a thought too radical for its time, but then so was survival. Across the dying world, 3 different humanities faced the same disaster with different strategies. Neanderthals would endure through biological toughness, surviving in their European strongholds for another 30,000 years before finally succumbing. Denisovans would disperse so thoroughly they'd become ghosts, leaving only genetic traces in modern populations. But Homo sapiens, they would do something unprecedented. They would change. Not their bodies, that took too long, but their minds, their tools, their social structures. They would transform disaster into opportunity. Standing in the ashfall, watching his daughter tear strips from her precious coming-of-age garment to make masks for the children, Kuda couldn't know he was witnessing evolution in real time. Not biological evolution, but something faster, more powerful, cultural evolution. The ability to solve new problems with new ideas, then spread those solutions faster than genes ever could. The mountain had attacked all humans equally, but only one species would turn catastrophe into catalyst, and that made all the difference. The ash was just the beginning. The real killer came wrapped in silence, invisible, patient. It slipped under furs, crept through cave walls, turned breath to fog and blood to slush. The volcanic winter had arrived. Mara found her son at dawn, or what passed for dawn, in the eternal grey, frozen, curled in the fetal position, his small body drawn tight against a cold that had stolen in while the exhausted adults slept. He'd been alive at middle night when she'd last checked. Sometime in those dark hours, the temperature had dropped below what a 6-year-old could survive. She didn't scream. Screaming wasted heat. 20 degrees colder than yesterday, Kuda muttered, reading the frost patterns on the cave walls. His band had found their own shelter, smaller than their traditional cave, but uncontested. 17 of them huddled in a space meant for 5. The closeness that had felt suffocating yesterday now meant survival. "The boy makes 3, someone whispered. 3 dead in 2 days. All children. The math was simple. Smaller bodies lost heat faster, less fat reserves, higher metabolism. The cold was culling the future first. Outside, the world had transformed into something from nightmares. The perpetual ash cloud trapped Earth's heat from escaping while blocking the sun's warmth from entering. Temperatures plummeted, then stabilized at levels that would have been considered severe winter before Toba. Now it was the new normal. "Look," Kuda's daughter pointed through the cave mouth. A family of baboons sat frozen in the trees, still gripping branches. Death had come so fast, they hadn't even fallen. Further out, a leopard lay stiff beside its half-eaten kill, predator and prey united in ice. The cold was democratic in its killing. But humans had something others didn't. Fire mastery. "We need more wood," Kuda announced. Simple words that meant probable death. Every expedition outside was a gamble. The cold killed in stages, first the fingers and toes, then confusion set in, then sleep that never ended. They'd lost a hunter yesterday who'd sat down to rest and never stood up. "I'll go," offered Taku, the strongest of their young men. "We all go," Kuda corrected. "Groups of 3. 1 watches for wood, 1 watches for danger, 1 watches the watcher." He'd learned this yesterday when they'd nearly lost someone to the creeping stupidity that came with cold. And everyone counts to 100. When you reach it, you turn back, no matter what. They wrapped themselves in everything they had. Furs layered over furs, ash-caked hides that stank but held heat, grass stuffed between layers for insulation, an innovation born from desperation when they'd noticed dead grass stayed warmer than bare skin. The world outside was alien. Ash had drifted like snow, creating a landscape of grey dunes. Familiar landmarks vanished under the monochrome blanket. Trees stood like skeletal hands, their leaves long, dead, branches brittle with frost. The only sound was the crunch of ash underfoot and the wheeze of breath through makeshift masks. There, someone pointed, a fallen tree probably killed by ash weight. Wood meant warmth, meant life. But as they approached, shapes emerged from the grey. Another band, also desperate for fuel. 7 adults, all armed, all looking at the same life-saving wood. "We were here first," their leader stated. A woman, Kuda noted with surprise, strong-looking despite the circumstances. "Wood belongs to no one," Taku growled, raising his spear. "Stop," Kuda commanded, then louder to the other band. "There's enough. We take half. You take half." And if we want it all? The woman's eyes were hard. Behind her, Kuda could see children, shivering, dying. "Then we fight. Some of us die, maybe all of us. And while we bleed in the ash, the cold kills our children." He lowered his spear. "Or we share, and maybe some children see tomorrow." The moment stretched taut as frozen sinew. In the before times, territories were sacred, resources were defended, but the before times had burned with Toba. The woman lowered her weapon. "Half." They worked together in silence, hacking at frozen wood with stone tools. No energy wasted on words. When they'd gathered what they could carry, the two bands parted without ceremony. But Kuda noticed something. The woman's band headed toward caves he knew. If they survived, they'd be neighbors. Back in their shelter, the new wood-fed fires that had burned continuously since the eruption. Fire was life now, more precious than food. You could survive weeks without eating. Hours without warmth meant death. "We need better insulation," Kuda's daughter observed. Always thinking, that one. She'd been experimenting, packing ash between 2 hides. The ash holds air. Air holds heat, like the fur of winter animals. It worked, not perfectly, but enough. They created ash-filled blankets, crude but functional. Another innovation born from necessity. How many more would they need? Night fell. True night, not the perpetual twilight of Ash Day. The temperature dropped further. They slept in piles, children in the center, adults forming living walls against the cold. Privacy was a luxury the dead could afford. Sometime in the darkness, Kuda woke to silence. The baby that had cried constantly since the eruption had stopped. He knew without checking. Another small body that would need to be moved outside come morning. Another mother who would keen silently, saving her energy for survival instead of grief. The killing cold was patient. It didn't chase like predators or strike like lightning. It simply waited, stealing heat 1 degree at a time, claiming those who made mistakes, who ran out of fuel, who gave up. By morning, that grey approximation of dawn, the frost inside their cave had grown thicker. Water froze in their gourds. Breath came in painful gasps that burned throats already raw from ash. "How long can this last?" someone asked. Kuda didn't answer, couldn't answer. The cold had killed more in 3 days than lions had in 3 years. And somewhere high above, beyond the ash cloud that had stolen their sky, Toba's violence was just beginning to circle the globe. The volcanic winter wasn't a season, it was a new age, and only those who could change faster than the temperature dropped would live to see its end. If it ended at all. The last green leaf in their territory fell on the 7th day. Kuda watched it spiral down, a brown, ash-covered thing that crumbled when it hit the ground. Around him, a forest that had fed his people for generations stood like a skeleton army, dead. All of it dead. "Papa, I'm hungry." His daughter's words cut deeper than any spear. They'd been rationing their dried meat for days, but 37 people, now 32, consumed food faster than hope. The usual fallback of roots, berries, and leaves was gone. The plant eaters had died first. Now the meat eaters would follow. We still have the seeds, old Naya suggested, clutching the leather pouch that held their emergency food. Seeds they'd normally plant come spring. If spring ever came again. Enough for maybe 3 days if we grind them. Seeds meant future. Eating them meant admitting there might not be one. But hungry children didn't care about philosophy. Kuda made the call. We eat half, save half. A compromise with extinction. The ash hadn't just blocked the sun, it had poisoned the earth. Even plants that initially survived the darkness died when their roots absorbed water tainted with sulfur and fluoride. The lucky ones died quickly. Others lingered, their leaves spotted with chemical burns, stems softening with rot. The trees bleed, Taku reported from a scouting expedition. He was right. Gashes in bark wept a black, tar-like substance. The forest was dying from the inside out. But humans adapt. Where plants died, opportunity grew. Bark, Kuda's daughter announced, returning from her own exploration. The inner bark. It's bitter, but... She held out strips of pale material. Not poisonous. I tested it yesterday. You tested it? Kuda's fear flared into anger without telling anyone. Someone had to. Her eyes held that dangerous mix of youth and wisdom that catastrophe breeds. Better me than a child. They learned to process bark, boiling it in precious water to leach out toxins, pounding it into a paste that could almost fool an empty stomach into thinking it was food. Pine needles, still clinging to dead branches, could be steeped into a tea that provided vitamin C. Lichen, that strange, not quite plant, survived where others died and could be scraped from rocks. But it wasn't enough. Never enough. The other bands are moving, reported their scouts. Mass migrations had begun. Humans following rumors of valleys where plants might have survived. Places where the ash fell thinner. Some headed for the coast, Kuda's original plan, though they'd been forced to shelter too soon. Others went underground, literally, searching for roots and tubers that might have escaped the poison. One morning, they woke to find another band had arrived in the night. 23 souls, looking like walking corpses. Their leader, the same woman Kuda had shared wood with, approached with something like shame in her eyes. We have children, she said simply, and you have fire. Kuda's band now numbered 32. Adding 23 more mouths seemed like suicide. But the woman held out a basket. Inside, mushrooms. Somehow, impossibly, mushrooms. They grow in the dead trees, she explained. The ash and death. It feeds them. Mushrooms, fungi, the decomposers that turn death into life. In the plant apocalypse, they thrived. It was salvation wrapped in irony, life sustained by feeding on death. The two bands merged out of necessity. 55 people crammed into spaces meant for 20. But more people meant more foragers, more innovations, more chances for someone to discover the next bitter root or poisonous-looking growth that turned out to be food. They developed a grim protocol. One person would try a new potential food, a tiny amount. Wait a day. If they lived, increase the dose. Wait again. Only after 3 days without illness would it be declared safe. They lost 2 adults this way. Heroes whose names would be forgotten, but whose sacrifice meant survival. Children learned to eat things that would have made them retch in the before times. Grubs pulled from dead wood. Bone marrow sucked from skeletons they found. A paste made from ground acorns that required days of processing to remove tannins. Calories were calories. Disgust was a luxury they couldn't afford. Look at this, one of the new band members, a young man named Pilar, showed Kuda. He'd been experimenting with the ash itself. Mix it with water and the bitter bark. It changes something, makes it easier to eat. Accidentally, he'd discovered that activated charcoal could neutralize some plant toxins. They didn't understand why it worked, only that it did. Another tool in their arsenal against starvation. But for every innovation, the world offered new cruelty. Animals that had survived the initial die-off now competed for the same scarce resources. A pack of starving hyenas attacked their foraging party, desperate enough to hunt humans in daylight. They lost an elder and barely drove off the rest. Even the hunters are becoming prey, Kuda observed. Worst were the other human bands. As food grew scarcer, territories that had been respected for generations became battlegrounds. They found evidence of violence, bodies bearing spear wounds rather than starvation's slower signatures. The math of survival was turning ugly. Fewer humans meant more food for those who remained. "We could take what others have gathered," Taku suggested one night. He'd lost weight like everyone, but his eyes had gained something harder. "We're stronger than some bands." "We are not animals," Kuda said firmly. "We're not plants either," Taku shot back. "And look how well staying rooted worked for them." The argument revealed a growing fracture. Some wanted to become raiders, taking from the weak. Others pushed for cooperation, sharing knowledge and resources. Both strategies had merit. Both had killed bands who'd chosen wrong. Kuda chose a middle path. They would defend what they had, but share knowledge freely. When they discovered a new food source, they told other bands. When others found something, they learned. It wasn't altruism, it was practicality. Dead neighbors couldn't discover new foods. By the 10th day, their original territory was bare. Every edible thing stripped, processed, consumed. Even the mushrooms grew scarce as more bands discovered them. The forest that had seemed infinite was revealed as heartbreakingly finite. "We move tomorrow," Kuda announced, coastward, following the original plan. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue for. The plants were dead, the animals were dying, and humans would follow unless they found new grounds to forage. As they prepared for the migration, Kuda's daughter brought him something, a small pouch. "Seeds," she said. "I've been saving one from everything edible we've found. Bark pine, ash mushroom, even the bitter root." He stared at her, this child forced to become a woman by catastrophe. She was thinking beyond survival. She was thinking about after, if there was an after. "For when the sky clears," she added. Kuda hugged his daughter, feeling her bones through too thin skin. She still believed the sky would clear, that plants would grow again, that seeds saved today might feed children not yet born. Hope. The most dangerous food of all, and the only one that might sustain them through the hungry darkness ahead. The child's cough started small, a tickle, an irritation. Within hours it became a wet, hacking thing that brought up grey-tinged phlegm. By nightfall, little Asha was drowning in air. "Hold her upright," the healer woman commanded. Though what healing could she offer against an enemy that came with every breath? The ash had found its way into everything. Lungs, throat, eyes. It was killing them from the inside out. Kuda watched helplessly as more of his merged band developed the ash cough. The elderly fell first, their already weakened lungs no match for the volcanic glass particles that sliced microscopic cuts with every breath. Then the children, then everyone. "We need..." Taku broke off, coughing so hard he doubled over. When he straightened, blood spotted his lips. They needed clean air, but where in this grey hell could they find it? "The water," Kuda's daughter croaked through her own raw throat. "When we put cloth in water and breathe through it." She demonstrated with a strip torn from her wrap, soaking it and holding it over her nose and mouth. "It catches more ash." Primitive, but it worked. Sort of. They tore every spare piece of hide, every scrap of fur, creating makeshift filters. Breathing became a conscious act. Inhale slowly through wet cloth. Try not to cough. Fail. Start again. But water was precious, and keeping cloth damp meant constant maintenance. They developed a rotation, 2 people whose job was simply to keep the masks wet while others slept. Life reduced to the basic equation of breath. "My eyes," one of the newer band members moaned. The volcanic ash wasn't just suffocating, it was blinding. Tiny glass shards scratched corneas, causing infections that turned eyes to weeping, pus-filled horrors. They learned to wash eyes with boiled water, to blink frequently, to resist the urge to rub that only ground the glass deeper. The ash attacked everything. Teeth wore down from grit in their food. Skin developed rashes that cracked and bled. But lungs were the battleground where most lost the war. 3 more died in 2 days. All from the suffocation that came not quick like drowning, but slow like being buried alive from the inside. They'd gasp like landed fish, chest heaving but no oxygen reaching blood. The healers tried everything, teas from boiled bark, steam from heated water, even cutting airways open in desperate attempts to bypass clogged passages. Nothing worked. The ash was patient, inevitable, inescapable. "We go deeper," Kuda decided, "further into the caves, where ash cannot follow." But deeper meant darker, meant bad air of a different kind, meant choosing between suffocation by ash or suffocation by stillness. They compromised, deep enough to escape the worst ashfall, shallow enough to breathe. The cave system they'd sheltered in turned out to be extensive. Passages led to chambers, led to more passages, and in the deepest parts they found something that made Kuda's skin crawl. Other humans. Lots of them. "No room," came voices from the darkness. "Find another cave." But there were no other caves. Everyone had the same idea. The underground had become humanity's last refuge, and it was filling fast. Negotiations were tense. Kuda's band now numbered 47 after the ash deaths. The deep cave dwellers had maybe 60. Add them together, and air itself became a resource to fight over. "Ah, we have children dying," Kuda tried. "So do we. Everyone does." In the end, territory was marked by invisible lines, this chamber for Kuda's people, that passage for the others, neutral ground for waste, water sources shared with suspicious cooperation. The ash had driven humans underground like moles, and like moles, they were learning to live in darkness. But living underground brought new problems. Smoke from fires had nowhere to go. They learned to build small fires, positioned under natural chimneys in the rock. Even then, the smoke mixed with ash to create a toxic fog that burned eyes and throat. "Listen," the healer woman said one night. They did. The sound of dozens coughing echoed through the caves, a symphony of suffocation. "We all die if this continues." She was right. They needed solutions beyond wet cloth and deep caves. Kuda's daughter, Ever the Innovator, had been experimenting again. "Tree sap," she announced, holding up a glob of pine resin. "Melt it, mix with water, let it cool, breathe the vapor." It helped, somehow. The pine vapors opened airways, at least temporarily. They created primitive inhalers, heated stones dropped in water mixed with resin, heads covered with hides to trap the steam. For a few precious minutes, people could breathe almost normally. Word spread through the cave network. The other band wanted to trade for pine resin. Negotiations that would have been simple in the before times became complex. What was breathable air worth? Food? Tools? Territory? Information, Kuda decided. They show us other remedies. We share the resin. It began the first medical exchange. The deep dwellers had discovered that certain clay, when mixed with water and drunk, helped with the stomach cramps that came from eating ash-contaminated food. Another group had found that charcoal paste drew infection from ash cuts. Knowledge became currency in the underground economy. But no remedy could stop the dying. The ash cough claimed victims daily. Bodies had to be moved to the deepest, most isolated chambers. Burial outside was impossible, with ash still falling. The smell of death, mixed with smoke and unwashed humanity, created its own toxic atmosphere. Children adapted fastest, as children do. They developed a way of breathing, shallow, careful, always through cloth, that became second nature. Adults who couldn't adapt died. Natural selection in real time, measured in breaths. "We're becoming different," the healer woman observed one night. "Changed. The ash is making us into something else." She was right. Humans were evolving. Not biologically, that took too long, but behaviorally. Every adaptation, from breathing techniques to underground navigation, was being carved into cultural memory. Those who couldn't change fast enough joined the corpse chambers. One morning, if morning had meaning in the eternal grey, they woke to find the ashfall had lessened, not stopped, but thinned. For the first time in weeks, visibility extended beyond arm's reach. "We could travel," someone suggested, "find better caves, maybe places where the ash hasn't reached." But travel meant exposure, meant leaving the devil they knew for ones they didn't. The debate raged for days, interrupted constantly by coughing fits that reminded everyone why they'd hidden underground in the first place. Finally, Kuda made the decision. "We send scouts, small groups. They search for cleaner air and report back." The first scouting party never returned. The second came back with tales of ash drifts 20 feet deep, of valleys filled with grey death, of no escape in any direction. The third brought news that changed everything. "The coast," the lead scout wheezed through his mask. 5 days' walk, maybe 6. The ash is thinner there, and the water cleans the air. Hope. Dangerous, painful hope. But what was the alternative? Dying underground, lungs filled with glass, children forgetting what sunlight looked like. "We prepare," Kuda announced. "Gather resin, make masks for everyone, plan the route. In 3 days, we go." The deep dwellers watched their preparations with something like envy. Some asked to join, others warned of dangers. Other bands turned feral, the ash storms that could bury travelers, the simple mathematics that said most who left the caves would die on the journey. All true, all irrelevant, because staying meant certain death, just slower. At least traveling meant dying with sky overhead, even if that sky was grey poison. On the last night, Kuda's daughter came to him with a bundle. "Masks," she said, "special ones, double-layered, charcoal paste between the layers, and these," she held up hollow reeds, "breathing tubes, in case we must hide from ash storms." 13 years old, and she was inventing respirators. Pride mixed with sorrow in Kuda's chest. What kind of childhood was this, where play meant designing better ways to breathe? "Will we make it, Papa?" she asked. For a moment, she was just a scared child again. "We'll make it," he lied. But maybe, with her innovations and their determination, it wouldn't be a lie. Maybe some would reach the coast. Maybe the ocean air would clean their lungs. Maybe. The Great Suffocation had taken almost half their number, but it had also taught them that humans could adapt to breathe anywhere. Underground, through water, through cloth and charcoal, and hope. They'd learned to breathe poison and live. Now they'd see if they could breathe ocean and thrive. The stream that had sustained Kuda's people for generations looked normal, flowed normal, even sounded normal. But when young Pila knelt to drink, the water that touched his lips might as well have been liquid fire. He jerked back, spitting and gagging. "It burns." Kuda dipped his own fingers, touched them to his tongue. The familiar water now carried a sharp, metallic taste that made his mouth pucker. But worse was what he couldn't taste, the fluoride levels that would rot teeth, the sulfuric compounds that would eat stomach linings, the microscopic glass shards that would lacerate from the inside out. "No one drinks," he commanded, "not until we know." But they were already 3 days into their journey to the coast, and their water gourds were nearly empty. The math was simple. Humans could survive weeks without food, days without water. Hours in the ash-laden air were using up moisture faster than ever. The ash? The healer woman diagnosed, examining the stream. A grey film covered the surface, and the water itself had turned murky. Everything that fell from the sky is now in the water. They tried filtering through cloth, still burned. Tried letting it settle. The clear top layer burned worse than the muddy bottom. One desperate soul tried drinking it anyway. Within hours he was vomiting blood. "We dig," Kuda decided. "Maybe the groundwater." They dug with tools, with hands, with desperation. 3 feet down, water began seeping into their hole. Someone tasted it. Less burning, but still wrong. They dug deeper. At 6 feet, the water ran clearer, tasted almost normal. Almost. "It's the best we'll find," Kuda declared. They drank sparingly, knowing even this might be killing them slowly. But slow death beat fast death. That was the new mathematics of survival. The next stream they found was worse. Dead fish floated on the surface, their flesh already rotting. The smell alone warned them away. But dead fish meant something else. Somewhere upstream, the water was so poisoned that even creatures evolved to live in it couldn't survive. "We follow streams to their source," Kuda's daughter suggested, "springs from deep underground, before the poison can enter." It meant going backwards, uphill, away from their coastal destination. But what choice did they have? They followed a dying creek upstream for a full day before finding its source, a spring bubbling from between rocks. The water here tasted not clean, but cleaner. They filled every container, even made crude new ones from animal bladders they'd saved. But 53 people drank water faster than one small spring could provide. They needed a system. Groups, Kuda organized. Some guard the spring, some scout for others, some continue preparing food, and some... He paused, hating what he had to say. Some test new water sources. Being a water tester was a death sentence with a timer. Sip from a poisoned source. Wait to see how sick you got. Survive. Try another. Don't survive. At least the others knew to avoid that stream. They lost 2 testers in 3 days. Heroes whose names would be forgotten, but whose sacrifice meant the group learned which water would kill quickly versus slowly. But even safe water wasn't truly safe. People developed stomach ailments, cramps, bloody flux, dehydration that killed as surely as the ash. Children were worst hit, their smaller bodies less able to filter toxins. "Boiling," the healer woman insisted. "All water must be boiled." But boiling meant fires. Fires meant smoke that mixed with ash to create toxic clouds. Fires meant using precious fuel they needed for warmth. Everything was a trade-off, and every trade cost lives. They developed a routine. Find water source. Test carefully. Dig if necessary. Boil if possible. Drink sparingly, move on before the source was exhausted or other bands found it, because water had become something worth killing for. They found evidence at the third spring, bodies of 2 bands who'd fought over access. The winners were gone, probably following rumors of cleaner water elsewhere. The losers lay where they'd fallen, already being covered by ash. Kuda's band drank quickly and moved on before they could become the next casualties in the water wars. The rain, someone suggested hopefully. When the rains come, they'll wash the ash away. But when the rains finally came, they were worse than drought. The water fell grey, loaded with ash from the atmosphere. Where it touched skin, it burned. Where it pooled, it created a caustic slurry that killed plants even faster than the ashfall had. They learned to hide from rain, to cover their water sources during storms, to never, ever drink rainwater no matter how thirsty they were. The sky itself had become their enemy. Animals knew before humans did. Kuda watched a herd of antelope, the few survivors, walk past a poisoned stream without drinking. They followed the animals to a spring the beasts had found, reasoning that evolution had given them senses humans lacked. It worked until the animals began dying too. Then they were following ghosts and rumors, chasing stories of mythical clean water over the next hill, in the next valley, always just out of reach. The children adapted fastest, as always. They learned to survive on less water than seemed possible, learned to gather moisture from morning dew on rocks, the only relatively clean water available, learned that certain plants still held moisture in their roots if you knew where to dig. "We're becoming desert people," Kuda observed, and it was true. Humans who'd lived beside rivers for countless generations were learning the water-hoarding tricks of desert dwellers. Except this desert was everywhere, and it was made of poison. One morning, they found a miracle, a deep pool protected by overhanging rocks that had somehow avoided the worst contamination. The water was stale but clean, tasting of minerals rather than death. "We camp here," someone suggested. "Stay until it runs out." "And then," Kuda challenged, "when 50 people have drained it dry, what then?" They took what they needed and moved on. But Kuda noticed some of his band had filled extra containers, hiding them. Trust was beginning to fracture. When water meant life, sharing became harder. The worst came when they found a band of the very young and very old, abandoned by their healthy adults who'd gone searching for water and never returned. The children were dying of thirst, too weak to travel. "We can't spare water," Taku said bluntly. "We barely have enough for our own children." "Then we become the monsters," Kuda replied. They shared what little they could, knowing it might doom them all. Half the abandoned children died anyway. The survivors were absorbed into Kuda's group, more mouths needing water they didn't have. By the 7th day of their coastal journey, they'd covered less than half the distance. Water detours, the need to stop and dig, the constant search for clean sources, all had slowed them to a crawl. "Listen," Kuda's daughter said one evening. They listened. Nothing. Then, was that waves, or wind, or desperate imagination? "The sea," she insisted. "I smell salt." Salt, the ocean, where rivers met sea and water was infinite even if undrinkable, where coastal springs ran cleaner, where maybe, possibly they could stop running from poison and start living again. 2 more days, Kuda promised his people, maybe 3, we'll reach the coast. He didn't mention that they had water for maybe 1 day, didn't mention that other bands were also heading coastward, that the beaches might be as crowded and desperate as everywhere else, didn't mention that he had no idea how to make salt water drinkable. But his daughter was already working on that problem, experimenting with evaporation, with filtering through sand and charcoal, always thinking, always adapting. "Papa," she asked quietly that night. "The old stories say the world was born from water. Do you think it will die from poisoned water too?" "No," Kuda said firmly. "It will die from poison. But we will make it clean again, drop by drop if we must." She nodded and went back to her experiments. Tomorrow they would either reach the coast or die trying, but tonight she was figuring out how to drink the ocean. Evolution in action. Adaptation in real time. Humans had learned to breathe poison air. Now they were learning to drink poison water. What else would this grey hell teach them before it was done? The smell hit them first. Salt. Rot. But underneath, something else. Life. After weeks of ash-deadened forests and poisoned streams, the ocean's stench was perfume. Kuda's band crested the final hill and saw their salvation, a coastline that looked like the gods had forgotten to kill it. "Water everywhere," someone laughed, half mad with relief. Then reality. Water we can't drink. But Kuda's daughter was already running toward the tide pools, dropping to her knees beside one. "Look!" Shellfish, hundreds of them clinging to rocks like promises. Mussels, limpets, things with no names but plenty of meat. The ash that had poisoned the land had barely touched the ocean's edge. Here, life continued its ancient rhythms. "Food!" Taku breathed, already prying a mussel loose. He ate it raw, juice dripping down his chin. Real food! Within minutes, the entire band was scattered across the rocks, gathering everything that moved and most things that didn't. Seaweed that looked like leather but tasted like hope. Crabs hiding in crevices. Fish trapped in pools by the retreating tide. But Kuda noticed something else. They weren't alone. Further down the beach, smoke rose from fires. Another band. Then another. As his eyes adjusted to distances his ash-dulled vision had forgotten, he counted at least 6 groups stretched along the coastline, all refugees like them, all discovering the same salvation. "We need to claim territory," Taku urged, "before the best spots are taken." But Kuda was watching an old woman from a distant band teaching children which shellfish would poison them. Watching men from different groups wordlessly coordinate to haul in a fishing net. The ocean was teaching its own lesson. There was enough for everyone, if everyone was smart. "We share the knowledge," he decided, "all of it. What kills, what nourishes, where to find it." The coastal bands developed an unspoken truce. Mornings were for gathering, each group working their stretch of beach. Afternoons for processing, smoking fish, drying seaweed, extracting salt. Evenings for sharing, information, innovations, sometimes food itself. Kuda's daughter became obsessed with water. The ocean was infinite but undrinkable. Springs near the coast ran cleaner but were few. She experimented constantly, building contraptions from shells and hides. "Evaporation," she announced after days of failure and small success. "The sun pulls water up, leaves salt behind. If we can catch it." She created crude stills, black rocks heated by sun, covered with hides, drops of condensation collected in shells. It produced maybe a cup of clean water per day. Not enough to live on, but proof it could be done. Word spread. Other bands improved the design. Someone discovered that certain seaweeds, when burned, produced ash that actually purified water instead of poisoning it. Innovation bred innovation, shared freely because everyone benefited. The beach provided more than food. Caves in the cliff faces offered shelter from the still falling ash. Kelp could be woven into ropes stronger than anything they'd made before. Shells became tools, containers, even jewelry, the first anyone had worn since Toba. Children, those who'd survived, began to thrive. The reliable food, the cleaner air, the simple absence of immediate death, all combined to let them actually be children again. They played in tide pools, built things from sand, learned to swim. Swimming itself became survival skill. The best shellfish grew in deeper water. Fishing improved dramatically when you could follow schools instead of waiting for them. Some children, born since the eruption, took to water like they'd never known land. "We're becoming sea people," the healer woman observed, and she was right. Feet were developing thick calluses from barnacle-covered rocks. Lungs were learning to hold breath for long dives. Eyes were adapting to pierce the glare of water. But the ocean gave dark gifts too. Tides that seemed friendly could turn vicious, sweeping away the unwary. Storms drove waves that destroyed a week's gathered food in minutes. And the things that lived in deeper water weren't all friendly. They lost a young man to something with tentacles, lost a child to an infected cut from coral, lost an elder to eating a fish that looked safe but carried poison in its flesh. The ocean was generous but demanded respect. Months passed. The ash still fell but thinner. The sky remained grey but lighter, and along the coast humans weren't just surviving, they were adapting, innovating, becoming something new. Kuda stood watching his daughter teach a mixed group of children how to read tides. His band had grown, absorbing survivors, merging with others. The rigid boundaries of the old world had dissolved like salt in water. "The forests will grow back," someone said beside him. Another band's leader, someone he might have fought in the before times. "The ash will stop. The world will green again." "Yes," Kuda agreed, "but we won't go back. Not completely." The coast had saved them, but it had also changed them. They'd learned the ocean's rhythms, its generosity and cruelty. When the world healed, some would return inland, but others would stay, their children's children becoming the first true maritime humans. "Papa!" His daughter ran up, excited. "We found something." She led him to a tidal cave where the receding water had revealed walls covered in handprints. Old prints from before Toba. Their ancestors had been here, had known this refuge. But underneath, fresh prints. Dozens of them, from all the bands now living here. "We should add ours," she said. They did. Kuda's large hand, his daughter's smaller one, pressed into ochre mixed with ash and placed on the wall. A record, a statement. We were here. We survived. We adapted. Around them 50 hands from different bands added their marks. No longer separate tribes, but something new. Coastal people, ocean-adapted survivors. The salvation wasn't just the food or the cleaner air. It was the forced cooperation, the shared innovation, the breaking down of old boundaries in the face of common need. The coast had saved their bodies. But it had also, perhaps, saved something more important. It had taught them that humans survive better together than apart, even if it took the end of the world to learn it. The scream echoed off limestone walls at midnight. Not pain, rage, pure animal rage that came from finding your family's shelter occupied by strangers who answered words with spears. Kuda woke to chaos. His coastal band had grown to nearly 70 souls, too many for the beach caves they'd claimed. Some families had moved inland, seeking shelter in the limestone caverns that honeyed the cliffs. Good shelter, dry, warm, already occupied. "They attacked us." Mira, one of his sub-leaders, stumbled into the main camp with blood streaming from a gash on her forehead. "We found an empty cave, started settling in. They came from deeper inside, no warning, just violence." Behind her, 3 families dragged wounded members. A child whimpered with a dislocated shoulder. An elder pressed leaves against a spear wound. The coastal peace was shattering against an older truth. When resources were scarce, humans became wolves. "How many?" Kuda asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't matter. 20, 30, they knew the cave, every passage. We were blind in their territory. Territory. The word tasted bitter. On the beach, they'd learned to share. But caves were different, finite, defensible, worth killing for. We go back, Taku growled. Take what we need. And become them, Kuda challenged, but he saw the looks in his people's eyes. Weeks of coastal plenty had made them forget the desperate mathematics of scarcity. Now, with more survivors arriving daily, even the generous ocean was straining to feed everyone. Papa, his daughter, now 15 and wiser than her years should allow, touched his arm. What if we trade instead of take? Trade, with people who'd just bloodied their families. But she continued, they have caves, dry shelter, we have coastal food, shellfish, techniques for clean water. What if? What if? The two most dangerous words in a world that punished optimism, but also the only words that led to tomorrow. Kuda took 20 of his strongest, not to fight, but to look like they could. They approached the contested caves at dawn, weapons visible, but lowered. The cave dwellers emerged like shadows, equally armed, equally ready. You attacked families, Kuda stated, not accusation, fact. You invaded our home, their leader replied. A woman, scarred and thin but with eyes that had seen too much to fear more. We've held these caves since the ash began, defended them, bled for them. And now you're starving in them. The truth hung between them. Kuda could see it in their hollow cheeks, the way they stood like wind might knock them over. They had shelter but were dying for food. The coast provides, Kuda continued, more than we can eat. But we need shelter. Real shelter. Share the caves. The woman laughed bitterly. You'll take them once you know the passages. Then you come to the coast, learn our ways, take knowledge back. Negotiations took days. Trust was currency nobody could afford but everyone needed. Finally, they agreed to an exchange. 5 coastal families could shelter in the outer caves. In return, 5 cave dwellers would learn coastal foraging, bringing knowledge and food back. It worked. Barely. Suspiciously. But it worked. Until other bands heard about it. The limestone cliffs held dozens of cave systems, most occupied by desperate groups who'd claimed them through blood or luck. As word spread of the Coastal Cave Alliance, pressure mounted. Why trade when you could take? Why share when keeping meant surviving? One morning, Kuda woke to find 3 bands had formed their own alliance. Not for trade, for war. They wanted the best caves, the richest tide pools, the clean water sources, and they had the numbers to take them. 100 fighters, his scouts reported, moving this way. Kuda's mixed coastal cave group had maybe 40 who could fight. The math was fatal, but his daughter, ever thinking, had been watching the tides. The king tide, she said, tomorrow. It will flood the lower caves the beach approaches. If we time it right, they prepared through the night. Not for traditional battle, but for something older. Terrain warfare, cave dwellers who knew every passage, coastal people who could read water like language, combined knowledge that the attackers lacked. The warband came at dawn, confident in numbers. They split, half attacking the caves, half moving along the beach. Exactly as Kuda had hoped. In the caves, defenders who knew the passages led attackers into dead ends, ambush points, chambers where sound distorted and torches died from bad air. Not killing, driving them back, making every foot cost fear. On the beach, the defenders retreated steadily, drawing the attackers onto sandbars and rocky outcrops. Just as the warband thought they were winning, the king, Tide, arrived. What had been solid ground became churning water in minutes. Attackers who couldn't swim, most of them, found themselves trapped on shrinking islands. "Surrender or drown," Kuda shouted across the waves. They surrendered, wet, humiliated, but alive. And in that moment, something shifted. The defeated band had expected slaughter. That's what they would have done. Instead, Kuda's people pulled them from the water, shared food, treated wounds. "Why?" their leader asked, suspicious of mercy. "Because the ash is enemy enough," Kuda replied. "We don't need to be." Word spread differently now. Not of weak coastal folk to be raided, but of strong people who chose not to kill. More bands came, but for alliance rather than war. The cave systems became connected communities, each contributing something: shelter, food, water purification, tools. They developed systems, cave assignments based on need. Families with children got the safest spaces, elderly got the warmest. Rotation schedules so everyone spent time learning coastal skills. Shared defense so no single group bore the burden. But it wasn't utopia. Fights erupted over resources, territories, old grudges. Two men killed each other over a particularly rich tide pool. A family was exiled for hoarding food while children starved. The council that formed to manage disputes made hard choices daily. Yet it held. The cave network became humanity's first city, not of buildings, but of connected shelters. Population grew to over 300. Knowledge flowed like water through limestone, each innovation spreading rapidly. Kuda, now grey-haired and tired, watched children play who knew no band boundaries. His daughter had married a cave dweller's son, their child belonging to both worlds. The wars that had threatened to destroy them had instead forced cooperation. "We needed the fights," his daughter observed one evening, "to learn the cost of not fighting." She was right. The cave wars had taught them that victory through violence was temporary. The winners still starved if they couldn't gather food, still died from exposure if they didn't know shelter. Only cooperation was sustainable. When the ash finally thinned enough to see actual sunlight, when plants began their tentative return, the Cave Coast Network had become something unprecedented. Not a band, not a tribe, a civilization in embryo, built on the simple recognition that diverse knowledge shared was better than singular knowledge hoarded. They'd entered the caves as desperate families. They emerged as a people. The wars hadn't been about caves at all. They'd been about learning to be human on a scale beyond kinship. And in that learning, they'd planted the seeds of every city yet to come. The river was dying. What had once rushed toward the sea now crawled through a landscape of ash-clogged channels and stagnant pools. Kuda's son-in-law, Paku, stood knee-deep in the murky water, trying to spear fish that were no longer there. Another failed hunt. Another day his pregnant wife would go hungry. "Nothing," he reported to the gathered fishers. "The fish are gone, like everything else." But Kuda's daughter, now a woman with innovations that had saved dozens, was watching the water with different eyes. The river wasn't empty. It was transformed. Where flowing water once carried fish to the sea, isolated pools now trapped them, concentrated them. "Not gone," she said quietly. "Captured." She led them upstream, following the dying river's course. In a bend where ash had dammed the flow, a pool 20 feet across held water that churned with life. Fish, hundreds of them, circled in their liquid prison, too many for the oxygen. They were suffocating slowly, mouths gasping at the surface. "The mountain made a trap," she observed. "We just need to close it." They worked fast, stones piled across the pool's outlet, woven grass barriers at the narrow inlet. Within hours they'd turned nature's accident into humanity's first fish trap. The harvest was obscene, more fish than the band could eat in days. Word travelled fast. Other bands arrived to see this miracle. Some tried to claim the pool, others wanted to learn the technique. Kuda, remembering the cave war lessons, chose teaching over hoarding. Find the pools. Block the exits. Take only what you need today. Leave breeding stock for tomorrow. Simple rules that would echo through millennia of fishing culture. But his daughter was already thinking beyond. If accident could trap fish, what could intention do? She began with tidal observations. Certain fish followed high tides into coastal streams, then retreated with the water. What if they couldn't retreat? She experimented with walls of stones that let water pass but not fish. Failed, adjusted, failed, better. The breakthrough came from combining coastal and river knowledge. V-shaped stone walls that funneled fish into woven baskets, gates that could close when schools entered, pools connected by channels that concentrated fish naturally. It's not hunting anymore, Paku marveled, watching a trap fill itself. It's farming, but with fish. The technology spread and evolved rapidly. Each band added innovations, double-walled traps that sorted fish by size, tidal gates that operated automatically, preservation pools where live fish could be kept fresh for days. But the real revolution was social. Fish traps required cooperation, building, maintaining, harvesting. Individual ownership made no sense when tides and fish ignored human boundaries. The trap builders formed the first occupational guild, sharing knowledge across band lines. The fish teach us, Kuda observed. They school together for protection. We must school together for survival. Children born since the eruption learned trap construction like their parents had learned hunting. But where hunting was chance, trapping was certainty. Reliable food meant reliable futures. Population grew. Health improved. Time once spent desperately seeking calories could be used for innovation. The trap technology evolved into engineering. Channels dug to connect pools. Sluice gates made from woven branches and sealed with ash clay. Some ambitious builders even created multi-level systems that sorted fish by species. But success brought new challenges. Who owned the fish in a trap? The builders? The territory holders? Everyone? Disputes erupted. Some were settled with words, others with blood. The coastal council that had emerged from the cave wars took on new importance. They developed rules. Builders got first harvest. Territory holders got a share. Surplus went to communal stores. Violations meant exclusion from all traps. A death sentence when traps fed everyone. We're becoming something new, the healer woman observed. Not hunters, not gatherers, managers. She was right. The fish trap discovery had changed more than diet. It introduced concepts that would define civilization: sustainable harvesting, resource management, technological inheritance, occupational specialization. When the first green shoots appeared on land, plants returning to the ash-enriched soil, some bands began drifting inland, but many stayed coastal. The ocean had saved them. The fish traps had sustained them. Why leave? Kuda, now old enough to be called an elder, watched his granddaughter improving trap designs he couldn't fully understand. She worked with children from dozens of original bands, their shared technical language transcending old tribal boundaries. Your mother saved us with innovation, he told her. You're saving us with institution. She smiled, not fully understanding, but she would. The fish traps weren't just catching food, they were catching the future, channeling human cooperation into forms that would outlast their builders. From the dying rivers of the Toba Winter came the first aquaculture. From desperate survival came sustainable system. From isolated bands came interconnected communities. all because a woman looked at trapped fish and saw not just food, but possibility. The mountain had tried to kill them with ash and poison. They'd responded by inventing civilization, one fish trap at a time. The old firekeeper was dying. After 40 days of ash darkness, his lungs finally surrendered to the toxic air. But even as death rattled in his chest, his eyes never left the flames. His apprentice, a boy of barely 12 summers, held the old man's hand and tried not to panic. "Never let it die," the keeper wheezed. "Fire is everything now." The boy nodded, understanding the weight settling on his thin shoulders. In the before times, fire was comfort. Now it was the difference between human and corpse. Without fire, they couldn't boil poison from water, couldn't cook the questionable food that would kill them raw, couldn't see in the eternal twilight, couldn't keep the cold from claiming them one by one. But maintaining fire in the Toba winter was like keeping ice frozen in summer. Everything was damp with ash. Wood was scarce. The constant need to move meant carrying embers like precious cargo. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and darkness would swallow them forever. "Show me again," the boy begged, "the storm technique." With trembling hands, the old keeper demonstrated how to bank coals in sand to preserve them for hours, how to wrap embers in damp moss that would smolder, not burn, how to read smoke patterns that warned when fire was dying. Lessons learned from his keeper who learned from his keeper, stretching back to the first human who decided wilderness could be tamed. By nightfall, the old man was gone. The boy sat alone with humanity's most crucial responsibility. Around him, over 100 souls depended on the flames he tended. No pressure for a 12-year-old who'd lost his parents to the ash cough. "I'll help," a voice said. Kuda's granddaughter, the trap builder, sat beside him. Two keepers are better than one. Together, they developed new protocols. Fire watchers working in shifts. Multiple fire sources maintained so losing one didn't mean losing all. Emergency ember bundles carried by runners. The knowledge that killed the old keeper when hoarded would survive by being shared. But wood was becoming critical. The coastal areas had driftwood, salt-soaked but burnable. Inland meant dead forests, but also meant leaving the relative safety of the shore. Every expedition for fuel was a calculated risk. "Bones," suggested an elder who'd been quiet for days. "In the before times, we burned bones when wood was scarce. Marrow fat burns long and hot." They tried it, collected skeletons of the creatures that hadn't survived, cracked them for marrow, stacked them like cordwood. The smell was horrendous, burning bone mixed with rancid fat. But it worked. A single mammoth femur could burn for hours. Fire became currency. Bands with good sources traded embers for food. Those who lost their fires paid any price to rekindle. The boy keeper found himself a banker of flames, deciding who received the gift of light and warmth. One night, exhaustion overtook him. He dozed, woke to find one of the main fires reduced to cold ash. The backup fires still burned, but the failure ate at him. Lives depended on his vigilance, and he'd failed. "Everyone fails," Kuda told him. "That's why we have systems, multiple fires, multiple keepers. We plan for failure because we're human." But the pressure was aging the boy rapidly. Dark circles ringed his eyes. His hands, constantly tending fires, were masses of burn scars. He'd developed a cough from smoke inhalation that sounded too much like the old keeper's death rattle. Then came the innovation that changed everything. A coastal band arrived with strange rocks, black stones that seemed unremarkable until one was accidentally dropped in a fire. Instead of cracking like normal stones, it caught fire itself, burned steady and hot with little smoke. Coal, they called it, though the name meant nothing. They'd found a seam exposed by a landslide, black rock that burned better than wood. Suddenly, fire maintenance became manageable. A handful of black stones could burn all night. No more desperate wood gathering, no more bone stink. But coal created new problems. Who controlled the deposits? How much could be taken without depleting the source? The Coastal Council faced its first resource management crisis. Ration it, Kuda's daughter suggested. Each band gets an allocation based on size. Extra for families with babies or elderly. Emergency reserves for when other fuel fails. It worked mostly. Some hoarded. Some traded their allocation for food. But overall, the black burning stones meant survival became less desperate. The boy keeper could actually sleep full nights, knowing the coal-fed fires would survive his rest. Fire technology advanced rapidly. Wind screens built from stones and mud, chimney holes that drew smoke away from living spaces, reflector walls that directed heat where needed. Each innovation shared, improved, spread throughout the network. But fire revealed a darker truth. As bands grew larger, gathering around shared flames, disease spread faster. The coughing sickness jumped from person to person in the close quarters. Children who survived ash and cold died from proximity to other humans. "We need separation," the healer woman declared. "Family fires, distance between groups." It went against every instinct. In the cold darkness, humans naturally clustered, but the healer was right. Bands that maintained distance had fewer deaths. The irony cut deep. Fire brought them together, disease forced them apart. The boy keeper, now recognized as a master despite his age, traveled between groups teaching fire management. He showed them how to create fire beds, sand pits that held heat for hours, how to dry wood in smoke to make it burn better, how to read the colors in coal that predicted how long it would burn. One evening, sitting with Kuda's granddaughter, he made an observation that would haunt him. "We're not keeping fires anymore, we're keeping civilization." She nodded. "Without fire, we go back to being animals, cold, sick, eating raw meat in darkness." "No," he corrected. "Animals never had fire to lose. We'd be less than animals. We'd be humans who forgot how to be human." The thought terrified them both. Somewhere in the genes of every person huddled around their fires was the memory of the first flame. To lose it now, after so long, would be failing every ancestor who'd kept the light alive. So they tended their fires with religious devotion, fed them coal and bone and precious wood, protected them from rain and wind and human stupidity, passed the knowledge to children who would pass it to their children. Because in the Toba Winter, fire wasn't just warmth and light. It was the thread connecting them to the humans they'd been before the mountain exploded, the promise that they'd be human still when the ash finally stopped falling. The boy keeper grew old tending flames, trained 100 others, saw fire technology advance from desperate ember hoarding to sophisticated heat management. But he never forgot that night when he dozed and almost lost everything. Fire was life. Fire was hope. Fire was the only light in a darkness that wanted to swallow human ambition. And as long as one ember glowed, humanity endured. The spear hit the tree 20 feet away with a dull thud. Too low, too weak. Lukey pulled it from the bark and walked back to his throwing position, his stomach cramped from hunger. 3 days since their last real meal. The rabbits were too fast, the remaining deer too wary, and throwing spears at small game was like trying to kill flies with clubs. "It's useless," he told his hunting partner Tam. "By the time we're close enough to throw, they're already running." Tam, younger but cleverer, was examining a dead branch. It bent without breaking, springy and alive despite the ash that had killed its tree. "What if," he said slowly, we could throw without throwing. Lukey thought the hunger had driven his friend mad, but Tam was already working, using a flint blade to shape the branch. He'd been watching the coastal trappers, how they use bent saplings to snap closed on fish. Same principle, maybe? For days, Tam experimented while others hunted traditionally and mostly failed. He tried different woods, different shapes, made strings from sinew, from plant fibers, from hair. Failed, failed, failed again. Waste of time, the hunt leader growled. Learn to throw properly instead of playing with sticks. But Kuda's daughter, now a grandmother herself, still innovating, saw something others missed. She watched Tam work, then quietly began her own experiments. Together, they discovered what would change humanity forever. The breakthrough came from combining ideas. Tam's bent wood, her string-making expertise from fish traps, a straight stick, light and thin, feathers from a dead bird split and bound to the stick's end. It looked like a child's toy. "Watch," Tam said, drawing the string back. The bent wood fought him, storing energy like a coiled snake. He aimed at a target 30 feet away, impossible range for a thrown spear. Released. The arrow flew too fast to follow. One moment in his hand, the next buried deep in the target. The gathered crowd went silent. "Again," someone whispered. He did. Same result. The hunt leader picked up the bow, tried to understand it. Drew. Released. The arrow flew wild, but it flew. Farther than any spear, faster than thought. How? Was all he could manage. Within days, everyone was making bows. Most failed. Wrong wood, wrong curve, wrong string tension. But enough succeeded. The Coastal Innovation Network kicked in. Someone discovered that heating the wood over fire before bending made it stronger. Another found that different arrows flew differently, heavy for big game, light for birds. The revolution was immediate. Hunters who'd been limited to 30-foot throws could now kill at 100 feet. Small game that had been impossible to hit became regular meals. Birds could be brought down in flight. But more important was the psychological shift. For the first time since Toba, humans weren't just surviving, they were advancing, creating something new instead of just maintaining old ways. "My daughter can hunt now," a mother observed, watching her 10-year-old practice. Too small to throw spears, but strong enough to draw a child's bow. The social implications rippled outward. Hunting had always been for the strongest. Now the clever, the patient, the accurate could contribute. Age mattered less. Gender mattered less. Skill mattered everything. An old hunter, joints too stiff for spear throwing, found new life with the bow. "I can't run," he said, sinking an arrow into a target, "but I can still feed my grandchildren." Arrow design became an art, different heads for different prey, blunt for birds to preserve meat, barbed for fish, sharp broadheads for deer. Each design tested, refined, shared. The boy firekeeper, now a young man, discovered that fire-hardened arrow tips flew truer and penetrated deeper. But success bred new challenges. More efficient hunting meant prey populations crashed faster. The council had to establish hunting territories, quotas, seasons. Conservation emerged from necessity. Kill everything now, starve later. "We're too good at killing," Kuda observed. "The bow makes us gods of death. We need to learn to be gods of restraint too." They developed rituals around bow construction, ceremonies for first kills, rules about what could be hunted when. The weapon was too powerful for uncontrolled use. Like fire, it needed cultural constraints to prevent it from consuming everything. Trade in bow materials began. Certain woods worked better. Yew, osage, bamboo where it grew. Regions with good bowwood traded with areas rich in sinew or proper arrowstone. The bow didn't just change hunting, it created economy. Combat, too, was transformed. The first time two bands faced each other with bows, the standoff lasted hours. Neither wanted to test this new arithmetic of death. Thrown spears you could see coming dodge. Arrows arrived like angry wasps, too fast for reaction. Changes. Everything. The War Council agreed. Defense. Raid. Territory. Everything. Fortifications that had never been needed suddenly were. Simple shields of wood and hide. Watchtowers where archers could command approaches. The bow made violence easier and therefore made peace more precious. But it was hunting where the revolution showed most. Success rates quadrupled. A skilled archer could feed a family alone. Groups that had been struggling suddenly had surplus. Time once spent desperately seeking food could be used for crafts, for innovation, for art. The first cave paintings after Toba appeared. Simple things. Stick figures with bows, animals pierced by arrows. But art nonetheless. The bow hadn't just fed bodies. It had freed minds. Tam, the inventor, became a teacher, traveled between bands showing construction techniques. But he always emphasized something beyond technique. The bow is powerful, he'd say, but power without wisdom is destruction. My partner Luki died last winter, shot by another human in a dispute over territory. The weapon I created to save us can also damn us. It was a lesson each generation would have to relearn, but for now, in the grey twilight of the Toba Winter, the bow was hope. It was innovation proving that humans weren't just victims of catastrophe, but adapters who could create solutions as fast as the world created problems. Children born in the Ash World grew up thinking bows had always existed, but the elders remembered. Remembered when hitting prey meant getting close enough to smell its breath, when hunting meant accepting that the prey might kill you too. The bow ended that equality. For better and worse, it made humans the undisputed masters of killing at distance. And in a world where distance from danger meant life, it made them masters of survival itself. The spear had made humans hunters, the bow made them super predators. And the Toba Winter, which had seemed like extinction's victory, became instead evolution's classroom. The bodies were found at dawn, and what remained of them told a story no one wanted to hear. 3 adults, 2 children, not killed by ash or cold or disease. The marks on the bones were unmistakable. Stone tools had filleted flesh with the same practiced efficiency used on deer. "Don't look," Kuda told the gathering crowd, but it was too late. Everyone had seen, everyone understood. Somewhere in their network of cooperating bands, the unthinkable had become thinkable. Who was all Taku managed to say. The old warrior, who'd faced every danger the Toba Winter offered, looked shaken to his core. The tracker examined the area. Small band, maybe 8 people, desperate. She pointed to the children's bones. They ate the youngest first. Silence stretched like a held breath. They all knew hunger. The gnawing emptiness that made you chew leather, eat bark, consider things that shouldn't be considered. But this was the line that separated human from monster. "We find them," someone growled. "Kill them before they kill others." And become them. Kuda's daughter, now an elder herself, challenged. "Murder those driven mad by hunger. Where does it end?" The debate raged for hours. Some wanted vengeance. Others wanted to pretend it hadn't happened, but the evidence was undeniable. Somewhere out there, a band had chosen the darkest path, and if one group had fallen, others might follow. Double the watches, Kuda decided. Travel in larger groups. And He paused, hating what he had to say. Establish code words, so we know who we're dealing with. But the damage was deeper than security measures could fix. Trust, carefully built through seasons of cooperation, cracked like ice under spring sun. Bands that had shared freely now counted their members when strangers approached. Children were kept closer. The elderly worried they'd become emergency food. Then the second incident. A lone traveler arrived at a coastal camp, wild-eyed and rambling. He spoke of his band, trapped by ash slides in a box canyon, how they'd eaten everything, leather, bones, even tried boiling stones, how hunger had driven them to draw lots, how the losers had volunteered, sacrificing themselves so others might live. Volunteers, he kept repeating. They volunteered to save the children. The children. Different from murder, but was it? The line between sacrifice and slaughter blurred in the grey twilight of survival. The council faced questions that had no good answers. Was consensual cannibalism acceptable? What if it meant children lived? Where was the boundary between human necessity and human evil? We need rules, the healer woman said, clear ones, before hunger makes more choose. The rules they established were harsh, but clear. Any band that killed for food would be exiled, cut off from trade, from fire sharing, from the network that meant survival. But those who were dying could choose sacrifice, witnessed by others, with the understanding that it was gift, not theft. Most importantly, they established food reserves, common stores that no single band controlled. Emergency supplies for when hunting failed and gathering found nothing. It meant everyone ate a little less, so no one faced the ultimate choice. We're choosing civilization, Kuda explained to the assembled bands. Choosing to starve together rather than feast on each other. But not everyone agreed. Splinter groups formed, leaving the coastal network. They called the rules weak, the council soft. In the harsh mathematics of survival, they argued, only the strong should live. Why feed the elderly who couldn't hunt? Why save children who might not survive anyway? These wolf bands, as they became known, haunted the edges of inhabited territory, sometimes trading normally, sometimes vanishing with members they'd traded with. The uncertainty was worse than open hostility. One winter morning, a wolf band approached Kuda's settlement, 20 strong, well-fed despite the season. Their leader, a man with filed teeth who called himself Devour, made an offer. "Join us," he said simply. "We survive, always. No hunger, no watching children starve. Just practical choices." The silence stretched taut. Everyone knew what those practical choices were, but everyone also knew their own hunger, had seen their own children's ribs showing through skin. "We have rules," Kuda said. "Rules." Devour laughed. "The mountain has no rules. The ash has no rules. Death has no rules. But you make rules that weaken you, that make you prey." "No," Kuda's daughter stepped forward. "Rules make us human. Without them, we're just clever animals. And clever animals with weapons are the worst kind of monster." The confrontation could have ended in blood. Both groups were armed, tense. But then something unexpected happened. One of Devour's band, a young woman, stepped away from her group. "I'm tired," she said quietly. "Tired of the taste. Tired of the hunting. Tired of becoming less human with each meal." Others followed, not many, 3, then 5, choosing possible starvation over certain damnation. Devour snarled but didn't fight. Even wolf bands had some rules, it seemed. He left with those who remained, vanishing into the ash-grey distance. The defectors told horrible stories, of children raised to see humans as prey, of rituals that made murder sacred, of a spreading darkness that threatened to consume whatever humanity the Toba Winter hadn't killed. We stop them, Taku said, now, before they grow. This time, Kuda agreed. Not vengeance, but prevention. United bands tracked the wolf packs, fought them when necessary, offered redemption to those who would take it. It was ugly, brutal work that no one celebrated, but it was necessary. Slowly, the wolf bands died out or reformed. Some were killed in fights. Others starved when their practical choices left them with no one to trust. A few rejoined human society, carrying guilt that would never wash clean. The last known wolf band leader was captured trying to raid a children's shelter, devour, thinner now, his filed teeth broken. The council debated his fate for days, death, exile, forgiveness. In the end, they chose something else. He would live, but he would tell his story. Travel between bands, warning what happened when humans chose the easy darkness over the hard light. A living reminder of choices that should never be made. I was hungry, he said at each telling, tears streaming down his face. We were all so hungry, but hunger passes. What we did, what I did, that stains forever. The cannibalism crisis passed, not because hunger ended, but because humans chose cooperation over consumption, chose to see each other as partners, not provisions. It was perhaps their greatest victory, not over nature but over the darkness in themselves. Years later, when children asked about the time of choosing, elders would grow quiet. Then they'd explain how humanity had stood at a crossroads, how the easy path led to full bellies and empty souls, how the hard path led to hunger but also to hope. We chose to stay human, they'd say, even when being human meant suffering, especially then. And the children, bellies full of fish and gathered greens, would nod without really understanding, which was, perhaps, the greatest victory of all. That they could grow without knowing how close their species had come to choosing otherwise. The bones of the eaten were buried with ceremony, victims not just of hunger, but of humanity's test. Monuments to the price of choosing civilization over survival at any cost. They were never forgotten, but more importantly, they were never repeated. Because in the end, cooperation filled more bellies than cannibalism ever could. Little Aya was 7 winters old when she solved the water problem. While adults dug deeper wells and traveled further for clean sources, she noticed something they'd missed. The morning dew on certain rocks tasted clean. No ash, no burn. Just water, pure as the before times. The rocks sweat clean, she announced to her exhausted parents. They ignored her at first. Children's observations ranked low when survival consumed every thought. But Aya persisted, leading them to her discovery. Smooth stones angled just right, collected dew that hadn't touched ash-contaminated surfaces. Each rock yielded only drops, but many rocks meant water without poison. Word spread. Adults marveled at what they'd missed. Soon every band had children assigned to dew collection. Their small fingers better suited to the delicate work. It wasn't much, but in a world where every drop counted, the children's discovery meant survival for the weakest. Infants, elderly, the sick who couldn't travel to distant springs. Kuda watched his great-granddaughter lead a dew-collecting expedition and saw the future reshaping itself. These weren't children as his generation understood them. These were survivors molded by catastrophe, aged by necessity, wise in ways that broke his heart. They don't play, he told his daughter. They practice survival. It was true. Where pre-Toba children had played hunt the deer and build the shelter, these children played find the clean water and treat the ash cough. Their games were survival drills. Their toys were miniature tools. Their lullabies were lessons. 9-year-old Tico invented the ash shoes. Watching adults struggle through deep drifts, He wove broad platforms from reeds that distributed weight like snowshoes. His child-sized versions worked so well that adults copied them. The boy who should have been learning to throw play spears was instead teaching experienced hunters how to walk. "We're stealing their childhood," the healer woman lamented. "No," replied a mother whose 3 children had all survived, a miracle in itself. "Childhood is learning to be adult. These children are just learning different lessons." The lessons were harsh. Children learned to read death signs before they could count properly. They knew which coughs meant ash lung, fatal, versus wet lung, treatable. They could identify edible insects by age 5, prepare pine needle tea by 6, maintain fire by 7. By 10, they were full contributors to band survival. But they also learned cooperation at levels previous generations never achieved. "Watch them work," Kuda observed. No squabbling over resources, no hoarding. They shared automatically, instinctively understanding that group survival meant individual survival. The harsh teacher of catastrophe had created perhaps the most cooperative generation humanity had ever seen. The children also adapted physically. Those who survived infancy developed remarkable resistance to respiratory infections. Their eyes, constantly irritated by ash, grew less sensitive. Their digestive systems processed foods that would have poisoned pre-Toba humans. Evolution accelerating in real time, measured in years instead of millennia. "They're becoming different," a grandmother noted, watching her granddaughter eat ash-contaminated roots without illness. "Different from us." Education transformed too. No leisure for decorative arts or elaborate stories. Children learned through urgent necessity. Mathematics meant calculating food distribution to prevent starvation. Geography meant memorizing clean water sources across vast territories. History meant remembering which foods had killed, which had saved. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. These children had never known abundance, never experienced casual waste, never lived without the spectre of extinction hovering close. It made them serious, pragmatic, unsentimental about survival choices. When 12-year-old Mira had to decide whether to share their band's last food with arriving strangers or save it for her own hungry siblings, she chose sharing without hesitation. "More people find more food," she explained with logic cold as winter stone. "Strangers become family when they help us live." The children formed their own councils, mimicking adult organization but often surpassing it in efficiency. They assigned tasks based on ability, not age or tradition. A 7-year-old with steady hands might lead tool making, while a 12-year-old with good eyes became lookout. Meritocracy born from necessity. They also developed their own innovations. Children discovered that certain grubs, while disgusting, provided more nutrition than larger prey. They learned to follow specific birds to fresh carcasses. They created silent communication systems for hunting, better than adult versions because designed by those who'd never known different. "We thought we were teaching them," Kuda admitted. "But they're teaching us how to be human in this new world." The generational divide became stark. Adults carried memories of the before times, mourning lost abundance. Children knew only the ash world, finding joy in small victories, a successful hunt, a clean water source, a day without deaths. Their baseline for happiness had shifted so far that adults sometimes couldn't understand their satisfaction with mere survival. But child mortality remained horrific. For every innovation, every adaptation, death claimed 2 of 3 before adulthood. The survivors were those who combined intelligence, physical resilience, and luck in measures that would have seemed impossible before Toba. One evening, Kuda found a group of children teaching each other in the firelight. No adults involved. They'd organize their own knowledge sharing, each child expert in something. This one knew mushrooms, that one understood currents, another could predict weather from wind patterns. "Why do you do this?" he asked. 8-year-old Simi looked at him with eyes too old for her face. "Because if one dies, the knowledge lives. We all carry pieces. Together, we carry everything." The practicality chilled him, but she was right. These children understood redundancy, backup systems, distributed knowledge in ways adults were only beginning to grasp. They were creating a new kind of human culture, one where information was as precious as food and shared just as readily. When the ash finally began to clear, when plants started their tentative return, it was the children who noticed first. Their sharp eyes caught green shoots adults walked past. Their constant foraging discovered which new plants were edible. Their adaptability let them pivot from ash world survival to recovery world exploitation faster than their elders. "They'll rebuild better than we would," Kuda told his daughter as they watched children planning where to attempt agriculture. "We'd try to recreate the before times. They'll create something new, something that can't be destroyed by the next mountain's anger." The children who survived Toba weren't just small adults. They were a new form of human. Cooperative by necessity, innovative by requirement, unsentimental by experience. They carried the trauma of near extinction in their cells, but also the knowledge of how to survive it. When they grew up and had children of their own, they passed on more than genes. They passed on a culture forged in catastrophe, refined by necessity, and proven by survival. A culture that assumed disaster, planned for shortage, and found joy in the marginal space between death and tomorrow. They were the children of ash and hunger, but they were also the parents of every human who would follow. And in their small hands, scarred by survival and wise beyond years, they carried the seeds of civilization's second chance. The mountain had tried to kill humanity. Instead, it created children who could survive anything, even the next mountain. Grok felt the mountain scream through his feet, but he didn't stop skinning the reindeer. His massive hands, strong enough to snap a wolf's spine, continued their delicate work. Earthquakes happened. Mountains grumbled. The reindeer still needed processing before the meat spoiled. "Skyfire," his daughter grunted, pointing north where the horizon glowed unnatural orange. Grok glanced up, assessed, returned to work. His people had survived ice storms that froze mammoths standing, had endured winters where the sun vanished for moons, had faced cave bears, saber cats, and weather that killed Homo sapiens like flies. Whatever the mountain was doing, it couldn't be worse than what Europe had already thrown at them. He was wrong, but his confidence wasn't misplaced. It was earned through 300,000 years of Neanderthal survival in the harshest conditions Earth offered. When the ash began falling 2 days later, Grok's band of 18 simply moved deeper into their cave system. These weren't the shallow, coastal caves Homo sapiens desperately crowded into. These were limestone labyrinths mapped through generations, with chambers for different seasons, different needs. "Strange snow," his mother observed, tasting the ash. At 70 winters, ancient by any measure, she'd seen everything. "Tastes of stone and fire, but we've eaten worse." That pragmatism defined Neanderthal response to Toba, where Homo sapiens panicked, innovated frantically, developed new technologies from desperation. Neanderthals simply endured. Their bodies were built for exactly this kind of catastrophe. The cold that killed sapiens' children barely registered to Neanderthal physiology. Barrel chests housing massive lungs processed thin air efficiently. Compact limbs conserved heat. Metabolisms that burned 5,000 calories daily were furnaces that laughed at dropping temperatures. When volcanic winter plunged temperatures another 15 degrees, Neanderthals simply ate more. Same as always, Grok told his son, teaching him to maintain stone tools in the dim light. World changes. We remain. But remaining required adaptations even Neanderthals hadn't faced. The ash-poisoned water sources they'd used for generations. Grok's band learned to melt snow from protected areas, to dig through ash layers to reach cleaner ice beneath. They didn't develop elaborate filtration systems like sapiens. They simply found cleaner sources and claimed them with a ferocity that made other humans flee. Food became the greater challenge. The reindeer herds, already stressed by regular climate swings, died in droves. But Neanderthals had always been opportunistic. They switched to smaller prey, rabbits, birds, anything that moved. Their powerful jaws crushed bones sapiens couldn't crack, extracting marrow that meant survival. All food is good food, Grok taught, demonstrating how to process a frozen bird carcass most would consider inedible. Crack the skull for brains. Splinter bones for marrow. Boil the rest into soup that could sustain a family for days. Nothing wasted. Nothing rejected. The social structure that seemed primitive to sapiens observers proved remarkably resilient. Neanderthal bands were extended families, often 3 generations of direct relatives. No complex alliances to maintain. No trade networks to collapse. Just family. Defending and providing for family as they'd done for millennia. When Grok's nephew broke his leg fleeing a cave-in, the band's response was automatic. They set the bone with expertise born from dealing with hunting injuries. They carried him when movement was necessary. They fed him from their own portions without discussion. This wasn't sapien-style calculated cooperation. This was instinct deeper than thought. But Neanderthals weren't unthinking brutes. In the depths of their cave, Grok's daughter created something remarkable. Using ochre and ash, she painted on the smooth wall. Not the elaborate scenes sapiens would later create, but something simpler, more profound. Handprints, dozens of them. The band pressing palms against stone, marking presence, saying simply, "We are here." The isolation that would have destroyed sapiens bands suited Neanderthals perfectly. They'd never relied on wide networks, on innovation spreading between groups. Each band was self-contained, carrying all the knowledge needed for survival in their genes and memories. When the ash made travel impossible, they simply stayed put. "Why would we leave?" Grok asked when a desperate sapiens band arrived seeking shelter. "Cave is good, has water, has warmth. Outside is death." The sapiens pleaded, offered to share coastal innovations, promised cooperation. Grok considered. His band was strong but smaller than before. Some genetic mixing might be wise. He allowed 3 sapiens to stay, 2 women and a man. The cultural clash was immediate. Sapiens wanted to modify everything, create better tools, improve hunting methods, build elaborate shelters within the cave. Neanderthals watched with amusement and occasional interest, but rarely adopted the changes. Their ways had worked for 300,000 years. Why change for a temporary catastrophe? But some innovations proved useful. A sapiens woman showed them how pine resin could seal wounds and prevent infection. Grok's mother, despite her age, learned the technique immediately. Practical knowledge was always welcome. Elaborate plans for future improvements were not. The hybrid children born from these unions embodied both strengths: Neanderthal physiology with sapiens adaptability. They survived better than either parent species, though they often seemed caught between worlds. Too innovative for pure Neanderthal bands, too robust for pure sapiens groups. As the volcanic winter deepened, even Neanderthal endurance was tested. Game became so scarce that their massive caloric needs couldn't be met. Some bands began the long walk south, seeking warmer refuges. Others dug in deeper, literally, following cave systems to geothermal warmth. Grok's band found a chamber where warm springs bubbled from deep earth. The water tasted of minerals but was clean, untouched by ash. The warmth allowed them to reduce calories needed for heat. Small prey gathered near the warmth. It wasn't paradise, but it was enough. See, Grok told the Sapiens refugees. Earth provides. Just need to look in right places. But looking required knowledge accumulated over millennia. Which caves connected to deep systems? Which minerals in spring water were safe versus toxic? Which sounds in the darkness meant unstable rocks versus approaching predators? Knowledge that couldn't be innovated, only inherited. That was Neanderthal's strength and weakness combined. They survived through deep, inherited wisdom that made them perfectly adapted to their environment. But when environments changed faster than inheritance could follow, they struggled to innovate solutions. When a sapien suggested they could increase the spring's flow by digging new channels, Grok refused. The spring was good as it was. Changing it might ruin it. Better to endure with what worked than risk everything on what might work. This conservatism served them well through Toba. While Sapiens bands collapsed from failed experiments, Neanderthals plodded on with proven methods. Their survival rate was actually higher than their more innovative cousins, but it came at a cost measured in generations rather than seasons. Young Neanderthals, especially those with Sapiens ancestry, grew restless. They saw opportunities their elders ignored. Why not try the new hunting methods? Why not expand the cave network? Why not trade with distant bands for resources? The generational conflict that barely existed in pure Neanderthal culture emerged with hybrid vigor. Grok's own daughter, influenced by Sapiens thinking, suggested they could preserve meat by smoking it in special chambers. Traditional Neanderthal preservation involved freezing or immediate consumption. This new method could extend food supplies dramatically. Try, Grok finally agreed, worn down by persistence. It worked. The smoked meat lasted longer, traveled better. Other Neanderthal bands, seeing the success, slowly adopted the technique. Innovation by proven example rather than theoretical possibility. When the ash finally began to thin, when temperatures slowly climbed from catastrophic to merely harsh, Neanderthals emerged from their refuges largely intact. They hadn't thrived like some coastal sapiens groups, hadn't innovated dramatic new technologies, hadn't restructured their entire societies. They had simply endured, like they always had, like they always would, until they wouldn't. Because the world emerging from Toba's shadow was changing faster than Neanderthal conservatism could match. The sapien survivors weren't the scattered, desperate bands that had begged for shelter. They were connected, innovative, aggressive in their expansion. They'd learned to survive catastrophe through rapid change. Neanderthals had survived through stability, and in a stabilizing world, that would eventually prove their downfall. But that was future's problem. In the grey twilight of Toba's winter, Grok's band remained, solid, enduring and unchanging as stone. They'd faced the worst Earth could offer and survived through sheer, stubborn refusal to be anything other than what they were. Neanderthal endurance had carried them through catastrophe. Whether it could carry them through recovery was a question their conservatism wouldn't let them ask. Lin stood on the Tibetan plateau at 14,000 feet, where the air was so thin that Homo sapiens would gasp like landed fish. But her lungs, larger than any human species before or since, processed the meager oxygen with ease. When the ash cloud from Toba crept across the horizon like a grey death shroud, she didn't panic. Her people had survived worse. "Moving weather," her mate grunted, using their simple language that was more gesture than word. He pointed at the approaching wall of ash. "We go higher, higher." Where sapiens would suffocate and Neanderthals would struggle, Denisovans thrived. Their bodies were laboratories of adaptation, genes for altitude, cold, disease resistance, dietary flexibility. They were evolution's wildcards, scattered across Asia like seeds waiting for the right catastrophe to bloom. But Denisovans left almost no fossils, a finger bone here, a tooth there, like ghosts that walked through prehistory, leaving only genetic shadows in modern humans. What we know comes from reading